Angelini, un espacio inédito en nuestra universidad, en nuestro país y en América Latina, que pertenece a las distintas facultades de la universidad y donde estamos contribuyendo a un esfuerzo de la universidad y de alguna manera del país también a generar una cultura pro innovación y pro emprendimiento, cosa que muchos de nosotros consideramos es algo absolutamente indispensable si es que nuestro país va a dar el salto hacia ser una sociedad plenamente desarrollada. Lo que me corresponde hacer es presentarles a el charlista que tenemos hoy. Creo que quienes están en esta sala seguramente no necesitan ninguna introducción respecto de la importancia que está cobrando el tema de envejecimiento en el planeta en general. Pero me enteré que recientemente en una de las reuniones plenarias más importantes de Naciones Unidas se identificaron 3 grandes desafíos de la humanidad para los próximos años y este fue explicitado como uno de ellos. Nuestra universidad tiene desde sus múltiples disciplinas un interés en hacernos cargo de este desafío que nos plantea un planeta y un país en que vamos a ser muchos más los viejos de los que fuimos en el pasado y por lo tanto es con un gusto muy grande que me toca presentar a la persona que nos hablará hoy día. Brian Kennedy pertenece al Buck Institute, que es una de las más importantes entidades del mundo dedicada a la investigación en temas de envejecimiento. La misión de este centro es descubrir cómo se relacionan estos procesos de envejecimiento con las enfermedades crónicas más propias de la etapa avanzada de la vida. Fue establecido en 1999, es una organización dedicada a la investigación básica, una organización independiente. Ellos se pueden pasar tranquilamente por las calles de Santiago porque es una organización además sin fines de lucro, con lo cual estarían muy contentos con esto. Y ocupa un campus de 36.500 metros cuadrados, un campus bastante grande, en Novato, California, al norte de San Francisco. El instituto tiene una planta de más de 260 personas, entre científicos y personal administrativo, y ha recibido numerosos reconocimientos, tanto del National Institute of Health, el California Institute of Regenerative Medicine y otras fundaciones privadas y otros individuos comprometidos con la filantropía, algo muy común en Estados Unidos y que han estado apoyando la causa de investigar en temas de envejecimiento. El doctor Brian Kennedy obtuvo su Ph.D. en el MIT y es una reconocida autoridad en el campo de la biología básica del envejecimiento. Él es actualmente el presidente o gerente general, el CEO del Buck Institute desde julio de 2010, donde llegó procedente del Departamento de Bioquímica de la Universidad de Washington en Seattle. Nació en Louisville, Kentucky, y es miembro de múltiples instituciones relacionadas con envejecimiento. Sus publicaciones son más de 60 e incluyen las revistas Cell, Nature, Science y los Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Ha sido editor asociado a la revista de gerontología desde 2006 y es además consultor para empresas en biotecnología y farmacéutica. Dada la naturaleza de estas charlas de Do Future, le hemos solicitado al Dr. Kennedy que su charla verse sobre las oportunidades y desafíos que desde su perspectiva, con su experiencia, él ve para los innovadores en este planeta que cambia y por lo tanto tenemos la posibilidad de mirar esto de que hay muchos más viejos como un problema, pero tenemos la posibilidad de verlo también como un fascinante desafío y como una gran oportunidad. No nos olvidemos que lo contrario a ser viejo es algo bastante más tieso y simple, y por lo tanto la idea de que vamos a ser más los de pitantos para arriba es realmente una buena noticia para el planeta, y así deberíamos ver. Dejo con ustedes, por lo tanto, al doctor Brian Kennedy. Brian, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. So first of all, I want to apologize for not being able to give this talk in Spanish. I only know one word of English, or one word of Spanish, and that's rapamacina, which I'll tell you more about later. I also want to thank you for the introduction. It's actually nice to get introductions in language you don't understand, because I have a feeling this was a really wonderful and positive introduction, and that always makes me feel nervous. And so, since I don't know what he said, it's okay. No, it's great to be here and hear about the ideas that you're taking in innovation and the research that's going on here. Certainly, we're thinking along common grounds, and hopefully we keep talking and see if something emerges. I'm going to give you a talk today that's a little bit of science, a little bit of economics, a little bit of demography, and hopefully there's something for everybody here. Really, it's around how do we turn this changing demography in the world, which everybody, all the governments say is a disaster in the making, into an opportunity in the making. And I think that's really possible by combining several different innovative thoughts together. And so hopefully I can help you come up with your own thoughts in that regard. This is the Buck Institute. It's the only research institute designed by I.M. Pei. It's worth coming to visit just to see the architecture. It's quite an interesting facility. It's about 20 miles north of San Francisco. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about aging today and focus on three issues which are really at the center of everybody's mind right now. Quality of life. Everybody wants to live healthy, long lifespans, and we're thinking about how we can achieve that from a research perspective. The problems associated with increasing healthcare costs in the United States is ground zero for that, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. And the societal impact that comes with an increasingly aging population. I travel to around 20 countries a year, and I get to talk to officials in these countries, and everyone's concerned about how things are going to change with the aging population. I'll tell you some of the thoughts I've heard. It's really going to be four parts of the talk. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on demography. Some of you probably already know that. I forgive you if you do, or forgive me if you do. The economic impact. I have to talk a little bit about my science, so I'll talk about biology of aging and research, and then a little bit about what I'm hearing are opportunities for innovation in this area. This is the main slide when it comes to demography. This is a 2002 publication from Science magazine, where they looked at the percentage of people over a given age in different eras. And in 2002, much of the world had under 20% of the population over the age of 60. The areas in red are greater than 20%. And you can see that was only Western Europe and Korea, Japan that had these issues. But by 2050, much of the world is going to be in this situation. And most of the major developed countries are going to have around 30% or more of their population over the age of 60. Much of South America is in the range of 20 to 24% of the population. This is a major change in societies, and it's going to have a wide range of impacts. And the governments and the societies that figure out best how to adapt to this are going to be the ones in the best positions for economic growth. Just a couple specific facts here. So within 10 years, there'll be 1 billion people worldwide that are over the age of 60. More than 50,000 people in Japan are going to be over the age of 100. Centenarians are the fastest growing segment of the population in Japan, in the United States, and much of Europe. In 2012, 810 million people are over the age of 60. That number is going to be 2 billion by 2050. Large numbers. Goes up dramatically with age. It's something you all know, but we don't think about it. If you go to the National Institute of Health website and look up cardiovascular disease and ask what's the biggest risk factor, they'll tell you it's cholesterol, 3.5-fold increased risk of cholesterol. for cardiovascular disease. People in their 20s don't get cardiovascular disease. The risk that goes up by the time you're 70 is more than 100-fold. And so the question is, maybe we should think about aging as a factor that enables chronic disease. It's a common factor that influences a whole range of different chronic diseases. It's the biggest risk factor for diabetes, for most forms of cancer, for most forms of cardiovascular disease, neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. What is it about aging that makes these diseases happen? And if we don't do anything about it, we're going to have a big portion of 2 billion people with Alzheimer's disease in the near future. Okay, what's the economic impact of all of this? Well, non-communicable diseases now are growing and growing. They're responsible for 63% of deaths worldwide. These are generally chronic diseases, much of them related to aging. They're going to cost over $30 trillion to treat in the next 20 years. And they're responsible for about 80% of deaths. 20 years from now, they will be in low and middle income countries. And what are they? They're the same things I just told you about. Cardiovascular disease, cancer, chronic respiratory, chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases, and other conditions. And even injuries and accidents go up with aging. So this is a big challenge. It's going to cost a fortune if we don't do anything. So at the individual level, there's lots of things to think about. How do we age? Do we want to age in a healthy way? Do we want to have a long health span? Or do we want to just be sick for a long time? Obviously, there's a huge benefit to being healthy. How do we prepare for our own retirement and our own age? Personal incomes, we used to set aside money and the governments would provide money to support you when you're retired, but that's not going to be enough anymore because you're living 20 years after you retire or 30 years after you retire under the current scenario. There's not enough money in people's bank accounts to pay for that in many cases. At the social level, what do we do as the great tsunami approaches? How does governments think about fiscal sustainability, pensions, healthcare budgets, which I'm going to talk about in a second? How do you get productivity, the cost in terms of having care providers in the family taking care of their parents and their grandparents and not working themselves, so that takes 2 people out of the work environment. What are the opportunities associated with retraining people as they get older to work in new professions that they can still be effective at? Geopolitical changes in business psychology. I just alluded to that already. Right now, a lot of businesses think of people over 50 as a big problem because they cost more money in salary and in healthcare. But in reality, they have wisdom and knowledge in ways that young people don't. And so the businesses that learn how to take advantage of these people, use them to their best utility, are going to be the ones that benefit as we go forward. And even things like declines in fertility are having a big effect. As longevity goes up in almost every country in the world, the birth rate goes down. The 2 of the longest lived countries in the world are Japan and Korea. They're the 2 countries that have the lowest birth rate as well. In fact, you can predict, even though Japan's the longest lived country in the world, you can predict when the last Japanese person is going to be on Earth because they're only having 1.3 children for every couple. It needs to be about 2.1 to sustain the population. And so I think the last thing I heard was at the current rate, in about 985 years, there's going to be no Japanese left. So, and so now we've gone in developed countries from worrying about overpopulation to worrying about not enough population. In Russia, they're now paying you to have children. And I told that to one of my friends, and she said, "Are they paying you to try to have children, or are they paying you to have children?" It's the latter. So, but that's the problems that are happening. So let's talk about the U.S. just for a second. Per capita GDP, we rank 14th in the world. That's actually a little bit of an underestimate. Some of the countries ahead of us are like Monaco and small countries that have very high income. For a big country, we're pretty high. What about healthcare? Number 1 in the world. We pay more money per person on healthcare than anybody else. So if you want to take one measure of how good a healthcare system is, longevity is not a bad example of that because it combines a lot of different aspects of healthcare into one number. So paying number 1 in the world in per capita healthcare, what's that getting us? What's our rank worldwide in longevity? 50. So the U.S. is spending a huge amount of money, and by a lot of measures, not getting much return from it. What are we doing wrong? Well, here's another way of looking at it. Let's look at the other countries. This is the total expenditure in health per capita in U.S. dollars, and this is average life expectancy. It's more or less linear. The more money you put into it, the longer the longevity is. Some countries are doing quite well. Chile is not on here. They're doing pretty well. I'll come back to that in a second. South Korea is doing well. Long life expectancy at low cost. But more or less it's linear. Oh, by the way, which of these dots is the United States? Does anybody want to guess which dot the United States is? Well, the truth is I cheated. I took the U.S. dot off. This is the U.S. dot. We're spending 2 times as much, and we're not just spending a little bit more. We're spending twice as much on healthcare as anybody else. And we don't get much out of it. And where do we spend that money? Later in life. Early in life, we're not spending much more than anybody else is. And as people get older, the costs go up everywhere. These are other countries. But they go way up in the United States. There's a lot of reasons for that. One reason is we certainly do everything to keep people alive in the United States, including very high-cost medicines that you can argue may or may not be worth it. A good example is Aricept for Alzheimer's disease. Here's a drug that made a fortune. It costs a fortune to provide to people, and you give it to people with Alzheimer's, and they live about 3 months longer on average. And it's not like they're improving their quality of life that much. Now, if I had Alzheimer's disease, I'd go get the drug and take it. But I'm not sure this is a good strategy. And I think too much of the medical industry right now is targeting keeping people sick longer, as opposed to thinking about how to keep them healthy longer. Okay. So where's Chile on this? I thought I'd put it on here. It's a success story. Here's the increase in lifespan over the last 40 years. In 1970, the U.S. and Japan were tied with each other. Japan's taken a significant lead in life expectancy over the U.S. Chile was much shorter at that point, and now has a longer life expectancy than the United States, at much less cost. It's hard to believe. Not because of Chile, because of what the United States has done wrong. And it's even worse than that. If you look at what's happening in the U.S., here's life expectancy. It is going up. It's gone up 4.2 years in males and 2 years in females over the last 20 years. But they also do another measure, and this is a paper by it came out in Lancet recently. They measure healthy life expectancy, or what I call health span. And health span's going up too. The problem is it's not going up at the same rate as life expectancy. And this is where the challenge is. And it led one paper to conclude, you're alive, but you'd rather be dead. And the problem is that if life expectancy is going up faster than healthy life expectancy, you've got an economic disaster. You have a lot of people that have chronic diseases that are around longer. And you can argue that you'd rather stay alive, and I would too. And I'm not advocating that we don't try to treat disease. What I'm saying is that the cost to society of having the life expectancy number going up faster than the healthy life expectancy number is a big cost. If you can get healthy life expectancy going up at the same rate or even higher than life expectancy, then it's an economic benefit. So there's the real challenge is healthy life expectancy. Here, let me give you an example. These are my 2 grandmothers. This is Eliza. She lived till 99. And this is Lita, who's living alone now at 101. I went to visit her. She's still getting around fine. She's starting to get a little bit of arthritis, but she's worried. But she still has plans for 10 years down the road. So she's extremely healthy all her life. And both of these individuals had a very long lifespan. But Eliza had health problems starting at age 60. She was taking 35 pills a day when she was in her 80s and 90s. And she had one thing going for her, and that was stubbornness. Doctors told her for years she wouldn't live. And she outlived 3 of her doctors. But the thing is, she didn't have an extremely long health span, though. She had all kinds of physical problems. She wasn't able to participate in a lot of things. She got dementia in her 90s. The difference is that my grandmother, Lita here, drove when she was 93. She was still active in society. She was in a bowling league. I don't know how popular bowling is here, but she was averaged 150 when she was 92. And so this is what you're looking for, because these people stay active, and if you can keep them working and get them in new jobs, they're actually contributing to society. This is an economic win and a quality of life win. And that's really what we're looking for here. Here's the numbers for Chile. Life expectancy's gone up much more in the last 20 years, but it's the same kind of problem. Healthy life expectancy is not going up at the rate of life expectancy. And so the challenge around the world is to make these numbers go up as much as those numbers. And so coming back to the point, this, I think, is the biggest risk factor for all of these diseases. And it's the common cause, or one common cause of these diseases. It's not the only cause. Each one of these diseases have specific factors that are important, but they all have aging in common. And so what we're thinking about in aging research field in the Buck Institute is how is it that aging enables all these diseases to happen? And if we intervene there, we might be able to take a different approach, which is to keep people healthy, prevent the diseases from coming on. And so here's the concept written another way. This is what a normal lifeline might look like. You're born, and at some point, mid to late life, you start to get onset of morbidity. You get chronic diseases. And you fight with those for a number of years, and then eventually you die. And if you ask people, do they want to live longer, a lot of them will tell you no. And because they assume what you mean is this second one. They assume that they're going to get sick at the same time, and they're just going to live longer. And effectively, this is what a lot of medical development is doing right now, research development. And actually, if we look at the interventions that extend lifespan, if we start by studying aging and find the genetics or the drugs that extend lifespan, they don't do this. You don't get sick at the same time. It's more like this. You still have a period of morbidity, but you delay the onset. And so you have a bigger ratio of health span to chronic disease. And I think this is certainly something that's achievable in mice. It's probably pretty good evidence it's achievable in primates, and I'm guessing it's achievable in humans too. So the challenge is, how do we do this? Now ultimately we might want this goal, which is to have compressed morbidity, where you live longer and you have a later onset of chronic disease. That's a great goal to have. I've seen less evidence yet in animal models that that's achievable. The one place it is achievable, though, is in these centenarians, like my grandmother, who are healthy at 100. They have a very late onset of morbidity, typically, and then they decline very quickly. So a lot of cases, what happens is people at 102, they fall and they break their hip, and then they have a rapid decline and die within 6 months to 12 months. And I don't wish that on my grandmother, but it's a pretty good lifespan to look for. And so there's a lot of studies, and some of which I participated in around the world, to look at the genetics of longevity. The truth is that for most of us, except for the 1 in 5,000 that live to 100, for most of us, environment plays a huge role. Nutrition, exercise, stress, all the things you hear about are important. Genetics is important too, but these other factors are very important. For these centenarians, it's more genetics. They pick the right parents. Their parents tended to live longer, their siblings live longer, and the challenge is to find what genetic interventions or what genetic mutations they have that help them stay healthy longer. And the early data that's coming in suggests that it's the same pathways that we've been finding in the animal models to slow aging. Insulin IGF signaling, TOR signaling, these are things that are also in the centenarian population. So it's nice because it tells us the studies in animal models are telling us something relevant about humans. So let's talk a little bit about aging. So it really, people have been thinking about aging for a long time. It goes all the way back to the Chinese Emperor Qin Shi Huang, who was the person who unified China. Also, all the terracotta warriors, he had those created. And he wanted to live forever, and so he decided that he would send 500 of his best warriors over to this other island, because there was a magician who had an elixir that made you live forever, and he said, don't come back without it. And so they didn't come back at all. And then he had his chemist concoct drugs that would make you live longer, and they came up with very high levels of mercury that they gave him. And one day in his 40s, the chemist made a mistake in the calculations, and he died of mercury poisoning. So that wasn't very successful. Actually, just parenthetically, they buried him in Xi'an in this tomb, So they've dug up all the terracotta warriors, but no one wants to go in and excavate the tomb because they claim that there's rivers of mercury in the tomb. And the tests they put down indicate that's probably correct, so he's still there. But when Darwin came up with natural selection, the preservation of favorable traits, he immediately started thinking about aging. Why should we get old and die? That should be selected out. That shouldn't happen in the population. You should be more fit if you stay healthy for longer. And Wallace even came up with, his contemporary came up with an even more specific idea. He said, when one or more individuals have provided sufficient number of successors, they themselves are mainly consumers in a constantly increasing degree, and they are an injury to those successors. So he postulated that aging was a way of getting rid of the older generation so that the younger ones could keep pushing the genetic line along. There's actually very little evidence for this. And I think the real clue comes from the following graph. This is global life expectancy for the last 10,000 years. Now, I admit that as we go back, it's more of an estimate. But from archaeological records, you can more or less predict the demographics of a population. And the data that's come in suggests that it held very steady at about 25 for much of up until about 1600 to 1700 when you started getting a lot of oscillations. Now these people weren't dying of aging. They were dying of starvation. They were dying of infectious disease. They were dying of predation, childbirth. They weren't living long enough to age. And so this is really what's become the theory of evolutionary theory of aging, is that we age because it wasn't important for most of the population whether you aged or not, because you didn't live long enough, and so it wasn't selected for. And this illustrates the point, though. In the last 300 years, which is a tiny second of time in evolutionary history, our society has completely changed. And so that the average life expectancy is now, this is an old piece of data, it's now in many cultures, as you've heard, in the 80s. And so that's changed the whole structure of society. It's continuing to do so. And it's going to change how opportunities arise to innovate, develop products specifically for aging population, and all aspects of it. So this is something to think about. So at the Buck Institute, we're really trying to hit this from all sides. We have approaches involved in healthy lifestyles and wellness and prevention. You know, wellness programs work if people pay attention. We more or less know what to tell people to do to stay healthy longer. The problem is that people don't want to do it and they don't adopt those lifestyles. So the challenge out now, there's a huge opportunity in the wellness field right now. The challenge is not to figure out what to tell people, it's to figure out how to get buy-in from the people you're selling the product to or giving the product to. And there's a lot of development around that to combine sort of gaming approaches with healthy life expectancy, healthy lifestyles. And so we can talk more about that if anybody's interested. We participate in some of those programs. We're very involved in education, training young people in how to do research, everything from third graders and just getting them excited about science and telling them a little bit about healthy lifestyles, to postdoctoral fellows. We have over 100 of those at the Institute that we're training in advanced research. And then we're involved in research that I'll tell you more about in a minute. Just a little bit about environmental factors. These are the top 10 risk factors for disease burden in North America and globally. So if you look at in North America, you might think, you've heard a lot about environmental problems, and I think those are important. You might think that pollution and things like that are big risk factors for disease burden, but the top 10 are all things that you can do something about. Tobacco use, high body mass index, excessive alcohol use. These are a lot of metabolic factors. Diets that are low in fruits, nuts, and seeds, particularly a problem in the United States, particularly fruits. High cholesterol. These are all things that people can change their own lifestyle to be healthier. And globally, a lot of the same factors exist. Globally, other things creep in, but the top five in North America, 4 of them are in the list globally as well. And if you look at intervention studies in the human population, all of them have weaknesses. You can point to specific issues with any of them, but they all are coming to more or less the same conclusion. If you find ways to sustainably eat better or sustainably exercise, there's a huge benefit. This is the Stanford Runners study, where they started with people in 1984 who were in their 50s. They took people in Palo Alto who ran modest amount of time each day, or 3 to 5 times a week, and they compared that to people who don't run. This is the survival curve over that time. 85% of the population that were running are alive, and 65% that don't run are not alive. Now, there are other factors and there are complications with all of these studies, but they're all pointing to the same thing. You can impact how you age. And so this is just a lot of what we do. We have a summer scholars program, high school students, undergraduates. We train science teachers in the United States, and we're looking to expand that more broadly around the globe too. And now to come to the research, we really have structured the Institute in a way that about half the faculty work on the specific biology of aging. What molecular level is causing aging to happen, and how do we find genetic interventions to do something about that? Dietary restriction, DNA damage, mitochondrial damage, you pick your favorite models, chances are somebody works that at the buck. The other half of the faculty work on specific chronic diseases of aging. We have expertise in Alzheimer's, somebody who works on Huntington's and Parkinson's, etc. We've incorporated a lot of stem cell studies in that, and we have a high level of technology, proteomics, genomics, metabolomics, all of this stuff is actively going on at the Institute as well. And the idea, again, is the centerpiece is aging. How does aging enable chronic disease to happen? So if you look at the approaches we're doing to develop drugs, we're taking the same approach everybody else. Some of our investigators are. State-of-the-art basic science to try to develop treatments for chronic disease. And so we have expertise, as I said, on all of these different chronic diseases of aging. And I just want to highlight Dale Bredesen's work on Alzheimer's because it's the furthest along in terms of developing drugs, and we're now doing a phase 2 clinical trial on Alzheimer's disease with his lead compound that's been happening at the Institute toward drug development. We also have been emphasizing our stem cell research. We have 3 young professors working on that have been at the Institute for a short period of time. I'll just focus on Deepak Lamba, who's working on ocular regenerative medicine. He's trying to recreate whole retinas in the test tube using stem cells for replacement in diseases. So coming back to this point, though, is that the real focus is on aging. And so the idea is to take a different approach, use state-of-the-art basic science to find ways to extend health span as a means to prevent the chronic diseases from happening. And this is an approach that I started in my lab about 10 years ago. It was a genetic approach, and we were working in yeast cells. And the way you measure aging, I'm not going to show you any data in yeast, but the way you measure aging in yeast is you take one cell and you see how many times it can divide and produce a daughter cell. And so we screened the entire yeast, knocked out every single gene in yeast and screened its lifespan. Got 300 genes that when you knock them out extend lifespan. Well, that's a problem. It's hard to work on 300 genes. And so what we did is we compared the data in yeast to the data in worms and found orthologs, where the lifespan in both organisms. And then we knocked that same gene out in mice to try to figure out if you have a conserved effect on aging in a mammal. And when we did that, we got really focused in on this pathway called the TOR pathway. So TOR is a protein kinase in the cell. I'm going to do a little bit of science here. TOR is a protein kinase in the cell that responds to nutrients in the environment. So when there's high levels of carbohydrates or amino acids, you turn this pathway up. That makes cells grow quickly. It makes development happen quickly. It makes reproduction happen earlier. But it also accelerates aging. If you turn this pathway down, you turn down all the growth factors and you turn up stress response pathways. And so what we found is turning this pathway down in the adult in the organism extends lifespan. And it works in yeast and worms, it works in flies, and we speculated it might work in mice. And fortunately, Easter Island came through with a solution to do this experiment because rapamycin, which was identified because a bacteria produces that on Easter Island, inhibits this TOR complex. And so we could very specifically go in with a drug in mice and ask whether turning down this pathway extends aging. And actually, this next experiment was not done by me. It was done by the intervention testing program of the National Institute of Health. And so the question was, will this specific drug extend lifespan? And the finding was that it does. Here's the survival curve. This is the survival, 50% survival and survival maximum lifespan of the control population of mice. When you gave rapamycin at 600 days of age, So that's the equivalent of about 60-year-old human. It extended lifespan 15% in females and 10% in males. All right, that may not sound like much, but it's actually, imagine that if that translated to the human population, that would be about 10 extra years of lifespan. That's more than you would get by curing all cancer in people over the age of 50. Because 2/3 of people don't die from cancer, and the third that do get other diseases and die 10 years later if they don't have cancer, if you treat the cancer. This could potentially have a huge impact if it were true. Well, but I told you it's health span we care about, not lifespan. So I want to show you some of the mice in this study. These on the bottom are the last 2 mice out of almost 1,000 of the control mice that were not treated. This one, it moves. This one's having trouble getting around using its back legs. It's having trouble grooming. It has coat problems. The experts on these things tell me it's disoriented. This one has a tumor, and again, it's overweight, which mice tend to do. It's also having problems. It's having a lot of problems tonight, actually. If you look at the same 2 mice, here's 2 of the mice treated with rapamycin at the same age. Now, they don't look like young mice. They're not 4-month-old mice. I'm not going to tell you this is a panacea for aging, but they're a whole lot healthier than the control mice. They're getting around the cage, they're looking for food, they're doing what mice do. I think they're happier too, but it's hard to measure that. And so, if you have an aging drug, you might predict it would prevent or protect against a whole range of different aging-related diseases. Well, it turns out that rapamycin had already been studied for a lot of those. It shows good efficacy in animal models of Alzheimer's, Huntington's, Parkinson's. It's already used in atherosclerosis, and it shows efficacy in some cardiomyopathy models. I work on dilated cardiomyopathy in this context. It's approved for some rare forms of cancer, and in clinical trials as a combination therapy for a wide range of cancers right now. And so this may be the proof in principle here that you can actually slow aging with a small molecule. And when you do, you prevent diseases from happening. Now, I just want to show you one brief study with rapamycin. We did a cardiovascular study. We took mice at 24 months of age, pretty old. The life expectancy in this strain of mice is about 26 months, so half the mice are dead around here. And we treated them for 3 months with rapamycin. And then we did a whole lot of studies, transcriptome, biochemical studies, metabolic studies. I'm not going to show you a lot of detail on this, just a couple slides to give you an idea of what's happening in these mice. This is echocardiography performed after the 3-month treatment. And what we're looking at here is 0 point is where these mice were at 24 months when we started the assay. And then the change is what happened over the 3-month window. So if you look at the control mice, the ventricular ejection fraction declined over the 3 months. Fractional shortening decline, that's a marker of reduced heart function. And the left ventricular hypertrophy went way up. If you look at the rapamycin treated mice, the interesting thing about it was I expected maybe that would slow down the process. What happened is that in 2 of the 3 measures, it actually reversed the process. The 27-month-old treated mice had better cardiac parameters than the 24-month-old treated mice that weren't on the drug. They did get a slight increase in hypertrophy, but it was much less than the control mice. So this is a specific measure of an organ function with aging, and you can see dramatic effects of rapamycin. These mice, they don't run faster, but they run more often, so they're more active on the rapamycin than the controls, and they run a bigger distance as well. And so we asked what was going on. And what we think is happening here is it's about inflammation. And so we measured here, this is an analysis of inflammatory cytokines in these mice. For the control mice, and when things get yellow, it means the inflammation markers are going up. And most of these go up in these control mice. And this is suppressed in the rapamycin-treated mice. So we're now looking at molecular pathways that rapamycin is suppressing the inflammatory response in the heart and improving cardiac function. But I think this is only one tissue. I think that you're going to see benefits across several, not all, but several tissues with rapamycin in aging. Now there's a problem with rapamycin. I'm not taking it. And I don't recommend you take it either. Because there's side effects. And for chronic treatment, you don't really want to take a drug that has significant side effects. If it's giving you another chronic condition, it's not keeping you healthy. And so certainly I hope I've convinced you that it's a nice proof in principle, but is this really a treatment approach? And the nice thing is there's two TOR complexes, TORC1 and TORC2. Inhibition of TORC1 by rapamycin is strong, and that's where you get most of the benefits. The current thinking is the longevity and much of the healthy disease benefits come from inhibiting TORC1. The problem is that if you give rapamycin chronically, this was shown by David Sabatini at MIT, you inhibit TORC2 as well. That leads to impaired glucose homeostasis, problems with hepatic metabolism, and other issues as well. And so the idea is that maybe you could modify rapamycin to have a better selectivity for TORC1 versus TORC2. And so we partnered with another company at the time called Biotica. Since then, we've generated our own for-profit company that spun out of Buck Research called Delos. And what we have is a whole set of modified versions of rapamycin, hundreds of them. And we've been able to screen these now for selective inhibition of TORC1 versus TORC2. And I'll just give you an example of one of these molecules here. So this is a measure of TORC1 phosphorylation here. So the controls, you have high levels of phosphorylation of two proteins, S6 kinase and S6. When you give the mice rapamycin, you block those phosphorylation events. But the problem is this is a TORC2 substrate, and you block this phosphorylation event too on AKT. This new compound has over 100-fold better selectivity. It's equal to rapamycin on the TORC1 substrates, but it doesn't touch the TORC2 substrate. So we're very excited about these molecules now in terms of developing them for different disease indications and maybe aging itself if we can. But that's only one. And then the next decade, there's going to be 10 or 20 of these small molecules that are coming out that affect aging in mammals. This is another one that's at the Buck Institute called thioflavin T, another investigator, Gordon Lithgow. This is the worm data. It doubles lifespan in worms. And already we're getting positive indications around chronic disease models in mice. And we're doing lifespan studies right now. So rapamycin may or may not be the right answer. But if it's not, there's going to be other things that will be. And so I think you're going to see a change in how research develops over the next couple decades, and that there's going to be the potential for molecules that extend health span. Okay, opportunities for innovation. I don't know, I don't have any answers here, but hopefully I have some questions for you. There are a lot of issues that need to be thought about when we think about what can be done about the problem with aging. At the fiscal level, it's about sustainability. How do you change fiscal policy to deal with the aging population? Do you increase taxation? Do you spend less, give less entitlement to seniors? Do you borrow money at the government level? The U.S. is good at that. Benefits policy, how do we reform pensions? Healthcare insurance benefits, how do we deal with that? And just the general cost of healthcare. Productivity, can you increase productivity by extending retirement age? And just to give you an idea, a lot of countries are thinking about this. This is state pension ages in different countries right now. The age for men and women, and whether there's a change plan or not. And if you look at most of these countries, they're planning to change the pension age because they have to. The costs are just too high. And the United States is still burying its head in the sand right now, but they're going to have to raise retirement age in the U.S. It's an inevitable event. When they want to adopt a strategy that actually deals with Social Security and Medicare, that's very likely going to be part of it. And so when people tell me, if you make me live longer, I'm going to have to work longer, I tell them, no, you're going to have to work longer. We're just going to try to keep you healthy while you're doing it, because it's got to happen in a lot of countries. Do we want to think about increasing fertility rates to balance demography? There's positives and negative things that come with that. And how do you do it? Immigration policy. One of the problems with Japan and Korea is they have no immigrants. So immigration in U.S. and Europe balances demography because it's young people that immigrate. If you have cultures that remain closed, then it enhances the problems with aging. And how do you increase efficacy and efficiency in healthcare systems? In terms of income sustainability, do you find ways to encourage people to increase their pension savings or individual savings accounts? How do you strengthen poverty floors? So there's a whole lot of questions to be done here. Well, one of them is McDonald's, and lack of exercise. But another one is that we don't encourage preventative medicine. People don't go to their primary physicians. They don't get checkups. And if you look at a country like Costa Rica, they have the same life expectancy as the U.S. at less than 1/10 the cost, because they have a system in place where doctors are induced to go see the 2,000 people that live close to them and actually check up on them every year. It's a simple way, low cost, that increases the health of the population. I've told you about longevity and anti-aging research. We think that's going to have an impact as we go forward. There are great opportunities in regenerative medicine and stem cells. I barely touched upon that today. I think those are important. And that field is changing so fast, I don't think we know where we're going to be in 10 years with it. And developing innovative treatments for disease is also critical. So combined approaches here to keep people healthy. And then there's a lot of research on what should be done in various countries. And one of the interesting things about Chile, the more stars you have, the more of a need there is to do something. So if you look at Japan, for instance, increasing immigration and increasing birth rate is a big issue. In Chile, there's no 3 stars here. And so one of the things that indicates is there's a fairly balanced approach at this point to aging. And that's one of the reasons life expectancy has been going up. But each country has a different set of problems here. And they're saying that there's a whole lot of different approaches here. And I think, again, I mentioned this earlier, that a change in the demographics, the increasingly older population that we're all facing, is not necessarily a disaster. It's a disaster if we don't do anything about it. But it's an opportunity if we adopt programs to mediate positive change. And I think they need to be holistic programs that deal with several aspects of aging at the same time, combine these approaches, and let's see what works, because older people have a lot to contribute to society. If you keep them healthy and find ways for them to function in society positively, you get rewards for that. So there has to be ways to do that. So, changing retirement age, better care, more money for research funding. The NIH, on this biggest risk factor for disease, they spend 1% of their budget on it right now. I'll give you an example. And so all of these other things, fertility rates, philosophy, all of these are important. They're all factors, and we need to think about them all in one big picture. Okay, I'll just leave you with a couple other facts before I close. These are 2 of the 7 reasons why older people matter. I guess there's only 7. I would have thought there probably could come up with a bigger list than that, but that's what came out. Right now, 47% of older men and 24% of older women are actively participating in the workforce. And in a lot of developing countries, about 90% of the population is working. And just to give you an idea, in China, which is the fastest changing demographics in the world, by 2022, the average age of working farmers is going to be over 50 and approaching 60. So these are just, there are a million of these facts. And they're all scary right now, but they can be good things if we do something about it. So I'll just close by, these are the people in my lab at the Buck Institute that have helped with the research that I showed you, and former people. I have lots of collaborators that help on various projects that I do. And we also have a lab in China. I didn't tell you any data from that lab today. But thank you for inviting me, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you.